The sound was deafening, a man screaming somewhere deep below, his voice echoing through layers of concrete and steel. The guards didn't even flinch. They just kept walking, their flashlights slicing through the darkness like narrow blades. "Keep your head down," one of them barked. "You don't want to see this part." But Daniel couldn't help it. He lifted his eyes just enough to see where they were taking him. Down a narrow stairway, cold air hitting his face, the smell of mold and rust so thick it made him gag. Then he saw it, the cage. It wasn't a normal cell. It looked like something built for animals, not humans. A row of steel boxes, each barely big enough for a man to stand. Inside one of them, he saw a pair of trembling hands clutching the bars. The man inside whispered something Daniel couldn't hear over the buzz of the flickering light above. The guard opened the last door on the row. "Welcome to your new home," he said, shoving Daniel inside. The metal slammed shut, the echo bouncing endlessly through the corridor. And then the footsteps faded, leaving him in complete darkness. For a few seconds, there was silence, until a voice from the next cage whispered, "You're in the cage now, ain't no getting out of here." That was the first night Daniel realized the cage wasn't just punishment, it was a secret part of the prison no one was supposed to know about. Men disappeared down here. Some came back broken. Others didn't come back at all. 2 months earlier, Daniel had been serving time at Rockfield Correctional Facility in Louisiana, one of the oldest and most isolated prisons in the country. Built in the 1930s, the place had a reputation that scared even the hardest inmates. Rumors said the prison had underground wings left over from the Cold War, places that weren't on the official map. But no one really believed it. Not until they met someone who had seen the cage. Daniel wasn't a violent man. He was in for armed robbery, a stupid mistake from when he was desperate and young. He kept to himself, worked in the laundry, and tried to avoid trouble. But trouble had a way of finding people in Rockfield. Especially when the guards decided you belonged in it. It all started after an inmate named Curtis went missing. Curtis was Daniel's cellmate, a quiet guy who'd been complaining for weeks about the guards beating prisoners in a part of the prison everyone called Sector D. One night, Curtis didn't come back from work duty. When Daniel asked the guards where he was, they told him, "Transfer. Don't ask questions." But everyone knew that was a lie. Transfers didn't happen overnight, and Curtis had no family, no lawyer, no one to vouch for him. Days turned into weeks, and whispers started spreading. "They sent him to the cage," one inmate said during chow time. "That's where they take the loud ones." Daniel didn't believe it, until one afternoon, while pushing laundry carts near the boiler room, he noticed a hidden metal door at the end of the hall. It was old, rusted, and had a heavy lock. But what caught his attention was the sound, faint, muffled crying coming from the other side. That night, he couldn't sleep. The noise echoed in his head. He wanted to forget it, but something told him Curtis might be in there. He needed to know the truth. The next morning, Daniel tried asking one of the older inmates, a man named Floyd who'd been inside for over 20 years. Floyd lowered his voice and said, "Son, that ain't none of your business. That door's been there since before I got locked up. You hear voices down there, you keep walking. Because once you go through it, you don't come back." But Daniel couldn't let it go. A few nights later, during a thunderstorm, the power went out across the block. In the confusion, he slipped away from his unit and went back to the boiler room. The door was still there. This time, it was slightly open. He pushed it gently, and the smell hit him, damp, rotten, like the air hadn't moved in decades. He crept down the narrow stairwell, his heart pounding. The deeper he went, the colder it got. Then he saw it, rows of metal cages, lit by one dim light bulb swinging from the ceiling. And in the first cage, huddled against the bars, was Curtis. His face was pale, his clothes torn, and his eyes looked almost empty. "Daniel?" he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Before Daniel could speak, a light flashed behind him, a guard's flashlight. "What the hell are you doing down here?" Daniel turned, but it was too late. The guard grabbed him by the neck and shoved him hard against the wall. That was the last thing Daniel remembered before everything went black. When he woke up, his head was throbbing, his wrists cuffed, and when his eyes adjusted, he realized he wasn't in his cell anymore. He was in one of the metal boxes. The air was so thin it hurt to breathe. On the wall, scratched deep into the metal, he saw 4 words that made his blood run cold. "Welcome to the cage." And then, from somewhere in the dark, Curtis' voice came again, weak, trembling, and afraid. "You shouldn't have come looking, man. Now they'll never let you leave." The buzzing light flickered above him as a shadow moved across the bars. It wasn't a guard this time, it was someone else, wearing a hood, dragging something heavy across the floor. Then Daniel heard the sound of keys jingling and footsteps getting closer. When Daniel opened his eyes again, he wasn't sure if it was night or day. Time didn't exist down here. The air was thick, heavy with dust and fear. His head pounded, his mouth was dry, and all he could hear was the slow drip of water somewhere in the distance. Then came the voice. "You're awake." Daniel turned toward the sound. It was Curtis, or what was left of him. His face was hollow, his eyes bloodshot, his voice hoarse from years of breathing that stale air. "You shouldn't have followed me," he whispered. "No one leaves the cage." Daniel tried to sit up, but his body ached. He asked, "Why are they keeping us here? What is this place?" Curtis laughed, a dry, broken sound. "It's where they bury the truth. This part of the prison ain't on paper. They call it the cage, 'cause once you're in it, you're forgotten. You don't exist anymore." Daniel stared at him, disbelief and anger fighting inside him. "You mean they're running this place off the books?" Curtis nodded. "Warden calls it behavioral control. But it's torture, man. They send inmates here to disappear. The ones who complain, the ones who talk too much, the ones who see things they shouldn't." A sudden noise echoed through the corridor, the sound of metal scraping against concrete. Daniel froze. A guard was coming. He quickly dropped to the ground and pretended to be unconscious. Through the bars, he saw the beam of a flashlight moving closer. The guard stopped in front of his cage, muttering, "You two better keep quiet. Doctor's coming down tonight." The moment the footsteps faded, Daniel turned to Curtis. "Doctor? What doctor?" Curtis' face went pale. "They call him Dr. Reeves. He's not a doctor like in hospitals. He experiments with isolation, with fear. Says he's studying human limits. I've seen men come back from his room, but they ain't the same anymore." Daniel's stomach turned. He had to get out. But how? That night, he stayed awake, counting every sound, memorizing every footstep pattern. Around midnight, when the guard shift changed, he saw something. A small vent on the floor, loose at the edge. It was barely big enough for an arm to fit, but maybe, he whispered to Curtis, "if we can pry that open, maybe there's a tunnel. Maybe it leads out." Curtis shook his head. "You can't. It's sealed from the other side." But Daniel didn't stop. He waited for the guard's footsteps to fade again, then used a loose piece of metal he found in the corner of his cage to dig at the screws. It took hours. His hands bled. His fingers cramped. But finally, one of the screws came loose. He pushed the vent aside, coughing as dust billowed up. A cold draft blew through, fresh air. "Curtis, there's a passage," he whispered, eyes wide with hope. Curtis crawled closer, his voice trembling. "If you make it out, tell the world about this place." Daniel nodded, reaching out to help him, but before Curtis could move, the light above them snapped on. "Step away from the vent," a deep voice shouted. Daniel froze. Guards stormed in, flashlights blinding him. One of them kicked the cage door open and yanked him out by his shirt. "Thought you could dig your way out, huh?" the guard growled. They dragged him down a hall he'd never seen before, a long corridor lined with cells that were completely empty. At the end of it stood a tall man in a white coat. "Dr. Reeves." "Mr. Daniels," the man said calmly, flipping through a clipboard. "You've been quite curious. Curiosity is dangerous here." Daniel spat on the floor. "You're torturing people down here. You can't just hide this." Reeves smiled. "Hide? We study. We observe how isolation breaks the mind. Some call it punishment. I call it progress." He signaled to the guards. "Take him to observation room 3. They strapped Daniel into a metal chair under a flickering light. The walls were covered with old stains, reminders of whoever sat there before him. Reeves leaned close and whispered, After a few weeks, you'll beg to go back to the cage. Then everything went black again. When Daniel woke up next, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. His beard had grown, his body was weak, but his mind still fought to stay clear. And that's when he heard it, voices. Not from the cage, but above. Someone was shouting orders. Doors slamming. Boots running. The ceiling lights flickered back on for the first time in days. Curtis' voice came faintly through the vent. "Daniel, the feds are here. They found us." He could barely believe it. The sound of explosions echoed through the corridor, flashbangs. Then shouting. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hands up." Guards scrambled. Reeves tried to run, but it was over. After decades of silence, the cage was finally discovered. When Daniel was pulled out by agents, his eyes burned from the light. Reporters swarmed the gates of Rockfield Prison for days. Headlines read, "Secret underground prison discovered beneath Louisiana Correctional Facility." Inmates describe years of abuse in hidden isolation unit. Dr. Reeves was arrested. The warden resigned. And the cage, America's darkest prison secret, was shut down for good. But not everything ended there. When a journalist asked Daniel what it was like, he simply said, "Down there, you stop feeling human. You start to understand what real silence sounds like. And it's something I'll never forget." He turned away from the cameras, his face calm but haunted. And even though the cage was sealed off forever, Daniel knew one truth would always remain. There are still prisons in America that no one talks about, places that still keep their secrets buried underground.